Hello, bros. We're back with Trousered Apes. Sick Literature in a Sick Society by Duncan Williams. Chapter 8. To be or not to be. And shall he, man, her last work, who seemed so fair, such splendid purpose in his eyes, who rolled the psalm to wintry skies, who built him fanes of fruitless prayer, who loved, who suffered countless ills, who battled for the true, the just, be blown about the desert dust, or sealed within the iron nails. Tennyson, in memoriam. One of the fashionable fallacies widely prevalent today is that the problems confronting mankind in the latter half of the 20th century differ only in degree from those faced by previous generations. They are, on the contrary, totally unprecedented, and until this is generally realized and accepted, no move towards their solution will be possible. The sources of the contemporary crisis can be summarized as an almost total loss of religious faith, a denial of any ultimate reference, a majority of the world's peoples under the age of 25, a population explosion which threatens to engulf mankind, and finally a nuclear ability to destroy the species. Having discussed the loss of religious faith and its consequences, I am now primarily concerned with the problems posed by a predominantly youthful culture and by world overpopulation. In his essay on criticism, published in 1711, Pope wrote, "We think our fathers fools, so wise we grow. Our wiser sons, no doubt, will think us so." These lines should dispel any illusions that youthful rebellion is a peculiarly modern phenomenon. Conflict and tension between youth and its elders has always existed, and once the formerly youthful attain maturity and parenthood, they in turn are subjected to the same contempt which they so recently lavished upon their parents. In the past, when the young constituted a powerless minority, this cyclical pattern was of minor importance. Today, it is of the utmost significance and constitutes an awesome problem for teachers, psychologists, sociologists, and all who are seriously interested in the contemporary scene. As Louis E. Reich, a psychiatrist at Princeton University, has stated, the problem of whether the youthful individual's aggressive energies will be expressed in useful or destructive ways has never before cast such a deep and terrible shadow over human life. In statistical terms, for the first time in the country's history, a large proportion of the population of the United States and of many European countries is under the age of 25, and this has already had profound political, social, artistic, and economic repercussions. Youth has many admirable qualities, including vigor, enthusiasm, a zeal for living, and courage. Adults are, however, in danger of forgetting that it is the physical and not the mental attributes of the young which arouse admiration, and that, as a rule, youth does not have, indeed cannot have, those two qualities which more than ever are needed to ensure man's survival: wisdom and restraint. It is surely more than coincidental that the popular appeal of existential philosophy, which places such emphasis on action as opposed to speculation, should have antedated a youthful culture by some 20 years. And we got a footnote. 1. Sartre, defending existentialism against the charges that it induces people to dwell in the quietism of despair, declares that if this were true, it would be merely a contemplative philosophy. He goes on to observe that since contemplation is a luxury, this would be only another bourgeois philosophy. In other words, contemplation is bourgeois. I never got the different spellings or sayings to be the which one is which. And anyone versed in communist jargon is aware that this is equivalent to declaring that contemplation is effete and ignoble. Conversely, one is meant to assume that action is anti-bourgeois, i.e., virile and praiseworthy. It may be recalled that in Animal Farm, when the animals' rebellion proved successful and the drunken, inefficient Farmer Jones had been forcibly expelled, two pigs, Napoleon and Snowball, vied with each other for control of the farm and its animal occupants. That Napoleon succeeded was due to his indoctrination of some young puppies in whom he was able to inculcate absolute and slavish obedience. No one who is old enough to remember the Hitler Youth or who saw Mao's Red Guards in action can fail to appreciate Orwell's message that youth can be trained, indoctrinated, and manipulated by irresponsible politicians and others to further purely selfish ambitions. The ultimate example of this must be the Red Guard, which hunted down and mercilessly destroyed all vestiges of the older, more cultivated, and civilized China. I actually forgot to read the rest of this. Footnote to a recent United Nations survey of the worldwide student demonstrations concludes that sit-ins, marches, and brawls with the police are only the forerunner of bigger and bolder protests. World opinion, it predicts, is going to become increasingly the opinion of world's youth, and the generation conflict will assume proportions not previously imagined. The suggestion by Jerry Rubin, the American Yippie leader, to a university audience that they should kill their parents lends unpleasant support for this somber world picture. The same survey estimates that the 12 to 25-year-old age group already totals 700 million and will reach 1 billion by 1980. A formidable force indeed. Back to the book. The tragedy is that those slogan-chanting, totally humorless, and apparently inhuman young people do not understand the cultural values they are destroying, nor do they understand the regime they are helping to institute in their place. They are content with action, with the knowledge that they are doing something, and are totally ignorant and heedless of the result of their actions. Recently, student unrest has erupted into mass violence at widely separated universities, at Berkeley in California and Warsaw in Poland, at the universities of West Berlin, Rome, Paris, Tokyo, London, and Wisconsin, among many others. All participants claim to be idealistically motivated, but the curiously similar faces of the student demonstrators, suffused with violence and hatred, scarcely admit the hope that the society they demand would be either as tolerant or as cultured as the one they appear determined to destroy. Formerly, students were assumed to be attending a university in order to learn. Today, a growing vociferous minority appears to be there in order to teach, but the permissible and relevant question is surely, how can one teach and advocate radical change unless one first understands the true nature of the problems confronting man and society? Problems which have taxed the best minds since the days of Plato and Aristotle. The Red Guard in China and the student demonstrators in Europe and the United States appear to share certain common characteristics: a hatred of anything which commands the allegiance and respect of the older generation, including a contempt for traditional ethical, and moral values, a passionate need to be active, and above all, a total rejection of authority, both secular and sacred. The folk heroes of today's youth, Thoreau, Che Guevara, Ho Chi Minh, share one common characteristic with the anti-heroes of Dostoevsky, Osborne, Salinger, et al. They were, or are, all in opposition to society which today's activists as well as artists regard as hostile, stupid, and malignant. I've already suggested that the true motives of many who participate in apparently idealistic movements may not be so flawlessly altruistic as some observers, and indeed some of the participants themselves may ingenuously assume. Youth is, after all, an impulsive rather than a contemplative period, and as Louis Reich observes, no high-spirited young man really wants to face up to the fact that the days of unbridled individualism are gone. As action tends to become an end in itself, causes for dissent and protests are assiduously sought and, when found, become a channel for the natural aggressive impulses of youth. If magically all the reforms and goals which youthful activists are demanding were overnight to become a reality and all their ideas achieved, does anyone seriously believe that this would mean an end to unrest and rebellion? Footnote. It may be recalled that John Stuart Mill suffered a nervous breakdown when he realized that he did not wish to see his ideas achieved. They had become such an obsession that he recognized that without their stimulus, his life would have been empty and futile. As the youthful population increases in numbers and power, and it has been estimated that by 1986, 35% of the world's population will be less than 15 years of age, society will come to resemble more and more an automobile with a powerful accelerator and no brakes. A machine which may satisfy youth's craving for speed and danger, but in social terms spells total unrest and eventually the disintegration of civilized life. In short, anarchy. Clearly, no society will tolerate such a prospect passively, and the reaction which will take place against the growing youth rebellion constitutes a great threat to our established political institutions. Democratic societies depend upon the sanctity of law and order, and only where respect for these is almost universal can true democracy survive. The vote and not the street riot, the reasoned argument and not the impassioned demagogic outburst, tolerance and not violent hatred, these are its necessary foundations. But almost wherever one looks today, moderation and restraint appear to be waning, and amid an excess of largely immature emotionalism. It has been suggested earlier that there are marked similarities between much of contemporary literature and the literary movement which took place in the latter part of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th centuries. That is to say, Romanticism, and if one examines this phenomenon in the light of an ever-growing youthful culture, it should cause little surprise. All the Romantic poets died young, including Wordsworth, whose poetic life really terminated when he was in his middle 30s. Romanticism is born essentially of the enthusiasm and rebellion of youth. Classicism stems from the wisdom and patience of maturity. Contemporary literature, which in both artistic and economic terms must largely appeal to the young, is, in spite of its apparent realism, essentially romantic. In fact, the much vaunted realism is largely confined to the development and exploitation of sex. Homosexuality, lesbianism, castration, rape, transvestism, masturbation, these are held to be the true realities of life, and their fearless display in novels, dramas, and films is regarded as evidence of an adult society treating mature subjects in an honest fashion. Parallel to and coincidental with this is the search for one's authentic self, and anything which imposes a curb or a restraint upon such search, self-control, manners, courtesy to others, tends to be regarded as dishonest or hypocritical. The underlying assumption being that the authentic self, when found, will be essentially primitive and barbaric. This search is but a contemporary version of the romantic cult of the noble savage, and what we are experiencing in the West today politically and in terms of literature is a new form of revolution and romanticism, those seemingly inseparable partners. This persistent conjunction becomes intelligible when one realizes that both emanate from a desire to escape from things as they are. Footnote 1. Significantly, Caleb Williams, a novel by William Godwin, author of the iconoclastic Enquiry Concerning the Principles of Political Justice, published in 1794, bore the subtitle Things as They Are. Godwin, Shelley's somewhat reluctant father-in-law, was, in theory at least, against the monarchy, aristocracy, property, money, religion, and marriage. His life scarcely reflected the high ideas which he professed, and he showed a marked financial ability to live off his son-in-law. The romantic writer achieves this escape by means of his artistic imagination, the revolutionary through attempting to translate his vision of a better world into positive action. To concentrate on sex alone and to imply that it is the sole reality in life, however, impeccable in terms of Freudian psychology, is to ignore or exclude large areas of human experience. One only has to consider the comparatively minor role which sex plays in Macbeth, King Lear, Hamlet, Julius Caesar, and Henry V, or, for that matter, Johnson's Vanity of Human Wishes, and Rasselas, whatever the hell that is, and I suspect that the genuine realism of these last two is too strong for many modern palates. To realize that writers in the past were not ignoring sex as a potent force in life, were yet aware that mature men and women may have other equally strong drives. Footnote 1. This is basically the point which Johnson made in his preface to Shakespeare when he wrote, "But love is only one of many passions, and as it has no great influence upon the sum of life, it has little operation in the dramas of a poet," Shakespeare, who caught his ideas from the living world and exhibited only what he saw before him. He knew that any other passion, as it was regular or exorbitant, was a cause of happiness or calamity. I have already suggested that the contemporary emphasis upon sex and primitivism may be an attempt to impose equality in Freudian rather than Marxist terms. The search for the primitive, authentic self is yet another manifestation of this same obsessive, egalitarian cult. If all cultivated arts and accomplishments can be shown to be simply a shallow veneer concealing the animal that lurks beneath the surface, then all men can be reduced to the same lowest common denominator, and that which apparently sets them apart from and above their fellow men, superior intelligence, ability, industry, perseverance, and so forth, far from being the virtues they were formerly assumed to be, can be ingeniously represented as hypocritical pretenses. Every revolution must have its myth, and the most persistent of these, and the one which, contrary to all human experience, has gained the most romantic adherents over the past century and a half, is the belief in the equality of man. As Margaret Mead has written, the assumption that men were created equal with an equal ability to make an effort and win an earthly reward, although denied every day by experience, is maintained every day by our folklore and our daydreams. In the realm of sport, this belief seems curiously absent. No man in his senses would dare to presume that he has, on the grounds of equality, an inalienable right to represent his country in the Olympic Games, any more than a boy would imagine he can automatically claim a place in his school football team. It appears to be widely recognized and accepted that in such activities some are swifter, stronger, more agile than others. Socially and academically, however, the opposite principle is continually asserted in various practical attempts in the Soviet Union and China, for example, have been made to establish it as a basis for society. All such efforts either have failed or must fail because no stable society can exist built upon a theory which runs counter to reality. The harsh but unavoidable fact is that men are unequal in terms of hereditary abilities. Some are born with a greater degree of intelligence, a greater capacity for sympathy, a greater ability to succeed than others. Furthermore, even were full gentility to become the universally acknowledged final goal of men, one cannot surpass the feeling that in this sphere, likewise, some would prove more equal than others. The persistence of this myth and the frustrations which it advocates experience, however, do constitute a grave psychological and political problem. If one were given the wrong solution to a mathematical problem, if one were persuaded, for example, that the answer to 5 multiplied by 3 was 25, had to be 25, then one would attack the problem repeatedly, attempting to force the figures to conform with their erroneous answer. As one repeatedly failed, so one's anger and frustration would mount to frenzy. Many of the proletarian and youthful revolutions which have taken place or are taking place, and which are based upon a similar false assumption, are characterized by a similar frustration and frenzy. One of the real problems confronting the world today is how to preserve order, gentleness, compassion, and justice while recognizing the inequalities which exist among men and which will continue to exist while men remain. Even if money, property, and all other external indications of superiority were to be abolished, some men, and even more women, would still appeal to their fellows, whilst others would repel. Some would earn the approval of their neighbors, others would forfeit it. Some would gain self-respect, others would lose it, and so on. As Samuel Johnson observed, so far is it from being true that men are naturally equal, that no two people can be half an hour together, but one acquires an evident superiority over the other. It is very dubious if this statement can be rationally demolished, but it would be interesting to have the reaction of a romantic egalitarian to it. The doctrine of the equality of man is yet another example of the dangers of abstract thinking divorced from reality. In economic and artistic terms, and never before have these two become such inseparables. The increasingly youthful market poses an almost insurmountable problem for the mature artist. Reorganizer. Never before has society been so permissive. Never before has it been so imperative for the artist to be novel, to outshock his competitors, to engage in what Fiedler terms the frantic quest for prestige in the pursuit of the chic. For example, in Alfred Alvarez's Under Pressure, a number of distinguished writers inserted that their greatest problems were posed by the insatiable public demand for novelty and for technical originality. Coupled with this, the permissiveness of contemporary society was cited as a hindrance rather than a help to the writer, since it removes the stimulus of opposition. Without contraries is no progression, wrote Blake, and it is possible that complete artistic freedom may prove as much of a bane as other freedoms are found to be when attained. It would appear that the emergence of artistic movements dominated increasingly by youth present at least two dangers. The first and most obvious is that they may result in immature artistic standards and goals. As the arts shape society, this will inevitably result in a growing social immaturity. Society will grow down rather than up. The consequences in a world capable of self-extermination are too obvious to need emphasizing. The mature writer, playwright, or painter will either have to capitulate to bow to the standards of the new marketplace or resign himself to catering for a dwindling number who will continue to demand something less jejune in literature, art, and painting. The less obvious danger is that if the young succeed in creating a culture and a society which revolves around those under 25 years of age, then they risk spending the greater portion of their lives excluded and isolated from that culture as a succession of youthful cults emerges equally as contemptuous of the previous generation and its goals as today's youth is of traditional culture. I'm stopping there because I'm not reading all night. 24 minutes into this video, nobody will listen beyond about 3 minutes. So we have a goldfish population that demands but doesn't follow through on that demand. All right, Bobs. Goodbye. That's all for now.